Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our January 22nd meeting of the Addison Central School District Board of Directors. Couple of quick announcements. One, those of you in the audience, please help yourself to the refreshments. Sometimes people think that it's just there for the board members, but we like to see a clean plate go home at the end of the night. So thank you. Also, for board members, one addition to the agenda within the executive session, we're going to add a negotiations conversation to that as well. Anyway, let's begin with a quick round of introductions around the table. Jen, would you lead us off?
Jen Newceder,
Josh Quinn, Business Manager.
Chris Eaton.
Lorraine Morse,
Peter Conlon.
Peter Burrows, Superintendent.
Jason Duquette Hoffman.
James Malcolm.
Victoria Jetty. Ruth Hardy.
Vicki Wells, Assistant Superintendent of Student Services.
So now's the time when we generally entertain public comment, but as we've been doing for the past couple weeks, if you have questions or comments pertaining to the proposed budget, you're welcome to hold them, if you'd like, until we reach that point on the agenda. Or if you are interested in leaving soon, you may speak now and skedaddle. Any public comment on anything else? Otherwise, we'll move right ahead here. Let's see. How about a motion? Oh, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say that I have my ballot, my petition I want to try to run for the school board.
Would you mind introducing yourself?
Davina Damari.
Okay.
And I live right in Middlebury.
Thank you. Thank you, Davina. All right. Could I have a motion to approve the minutes of January 11th?
So moved.
Thank you, Victoria. A second? Anybody?
Second.
Thank you. Any changes, corrections people feel they need or want to make? Hearing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes for January 11th, please say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody wishing to abstain?
And is someone taking minutes today?
Yes, Lorraine is. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine.
Oh, no problem. My pleasure. Just like old times.
Yeah.
All right, we have one set of bills. Chip and I reviewed them, and Ruth, would you?
We actually have two sets of bills.
Two sets, okay.
From the January 16th, Ruth and Mary did them, $108,856.29. And then today, Chip and Peter Conlon reviewed them, $273,265.22. And I will pass this official pink piece of paper over to Lorraine.
Is that a motion to move?
Sure, yes.
All right. And a second?
Yeah, second.
Thank you, Chip. All those in favor of paying the director's orders as reported, please say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? All right. Thank you. Great. Well, tonight we are going to get an update on the Task Force on Racism, Bias, and Discrimination. And I would ask you both to introduce yourselves, and you have the floor. And thank you very much for coming out tonight. I appreciate it.
I'm Kristen Holzman-Franco. I'm the principal of Moms.
I'm Miguel Fernandez. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer at the college and from Waybridge.
And we serve as the co-chairs of the task force. Thank you for giving us that charge. And to date, the task force has met 4 times. We have 2 more meetings scheduled, one in February and one in early March. And in that time, we looked at why to each of us on the task force this work is important. We've looked at a variety of resources.
Teaching tolerance, talked about a number of aspects along this. We've reviewed the ACSD processes for reporting and responding to incidents of bullying and harassment, for instance.
And we, at this point, have developed the first draft of a list of recommendations, as we had been asked to do. And on February 5th, we will be meeting with Rebecca Haslam of Seed the Way, who's going to come in and meet with us. Rebecca does work throughout the state of Vermont on just these topics. And she's going to come and meet with the task force to talk about our recommendations, give us some guidance in terms of additional supports and resources. And as part of that, we are here to request that we would like some additional time to continue this work. We anticipate being done by the end of May at the very latest. but we do ask your patience in giving us a little more time to do this work.
Thank you. Questions?
I have a couple of questions. One, I'll just ask them and then you can answer them in whatever order you want. So one is as related to the budget process and whether or not your recommendations may require, one of the reasons we had this timeline is so that if we needed to address something in the budget, we could do so. But whether you anticipate that necessary or whether it could be done within the budget that we have put forth at this point. And then also whether or not you've taken parental testimony. I know there were a lot of parents who had concerns, and I know that was sort of a touchy, we weren't sure how it was going to happen, and a parent asked me the other day, and I said I wasn't sure, so that I would ask you tonight. So what you've decided to do in that area. So those are my two questions.
Your 2 questions, okay. The first question is, nothing in our recommendations is expensive or was looking for any additional budgetary supports.
There's a lot of work about working with the IB program. There are reviewing policies and having different approaches. So a lot of it is sort of programmatic changes of approaches, those kinds of recommendations. That doesn't mean that down the line there wouldn't be some cost and potential programming to be involved in the communities,
But not at this point.
Okay.
And in terms of the parent testimony, no, we did not take additional parent testimony. We took the information from the minutes and the articles that had come forward out of the board meetings. And then individual members on the task force have also shared their stories and things that have been shared with them.
Okay.
We did feel very strongly that in asking for additional testimony within the task force, we began to blur our roles in terms of some of us on the board having an investigative role within the district, those things, and so wanting to move forward.
Okay.
And I'd just add to that it felt as though we already knew we were going to be pressed for time, and that would easily have taken up all of our time and not allowed us to advance with some actual recommendations.
Jason?
It's my understanding that there is, or at least there was, an effort to convene a group working on particularly anti-bias policies at the state level. The VSBA and any, I think, were involved in that. Have you had any contact with that working group, or do you any idea what they're working on or how that aligns with where you're coming from?
We have not had direct contact with them. However, Rebecca Haslam, who will be working with us in February, has been working with them directly.
Yeah, I think she's the consultant working with that group. Yeah.
So our next meeting is February 5th, and we're looking forward to hearing from her as well as sharing what we've got with her. So.
Thanks. Any other questions, board members?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the work you're doing. Have people been able to basically get to your meetings? Have you been able to get the majority of the task force to all four that you've had so far?
Yeah, I've been absent on a couple of occasions, but for the most part, yes, we've had more than a quorum, and just a couple of people usually will miss each.
Great.
It's meant for early mornings, but that's people have been keen, which has been a nice, pleasant surprise. I mean,
It has been.
people's been engaged.
Well, I think it would be appropriate for the board, since we voted and created the sort of the outline of this task force, that we probably should have a motion and a vote in terms of extending the deadline for the continuation of the task force. So if somebody would like to move that, second it, that'd be great. Thank you. So we have a motion to grant the extension of the task force until May.
Can we
Second.
pick a date in May? Is there a date that you guys targeted?
We didn't.
Maybe just by the end of May?
By the
By
end of May? Yeah, just so
Okay.
we.
Does that sound okay?
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? Again, thank you very much, and thank you for taking the time and patience with it.
Drive safely.
Yes. you too.
Slowly.
And good luck.
Thank you.
All right, now for our main course. This will be our third or fourth meeting on the budget proposal. And I think that, Ruth, you're going to kind of catch us up to date as to where things are. And then tonight's the night that we need to adopt the budget for the warning so that we meet our statutory date requirements.
How do
All
I
you-
get this? That was on earlier, wasn't it?
Peter, how do you get?
How do I get
The
this?
slide.
It's all ready to go, you just gotta open it up here.
Okay.
Oh, tall guy?
Tall guy job.
Just slide that over, yeah.
Perfect. There are seats up front.
There's always
was good
a
for
place for the tall
something,
guys and a
yeah.
place for the short guys. Except we always had to go in tunnels.
These chairs, Amy?
Or you can bring a chair over there if you want.
Okay.
Lights or something?
Maybe a couple up front. Can you do that?
Do you want me to put it back to the, what do you want to look
I
at?
save my battery while we're seeing something else. Maybe I can put it back in.
Me too. Find another tab that just don't spill the coffee on it. I'll try not to. Thank you.
Okay, so,
I don't know which way to look. So I'm Ruth Hardy. I'm the chair of the Finance Committee. And the Finance Committee has not had a chance to meet since the last meeting. And I'm the only member of the Finance Committee here tonight. So I'm going to give a presentation about the budget. And I'm going to do it as well as I can with this technology. And as my dear friend Jason has pointed out to me, I am a numbers person. I love to talk about numbers and budgets. I've been doing it my entire career. And so you will note, dear Jason, that this presentation has almost no numbers in it. And so I've been trying really hard to think about the budget from the perspective of non-numbers people and to answer some of the questions that have been posed over the last few months by this board and by members of our community. I'm sorry if I'm back to you.
That's okay.
I wanted to start by the sort of working goals and questions that the Finance Committee started asking back in the fall when we started to really dig into the budget, knowing that it was going to be a fairly challenging budget. And it was a meeting, we met really frequently, and I liked to term those meetings Me and the Boys, because it was Peter, Josh, Steve, and Nick and I meeting all the time, talking about budgets and numbers and trying to work through a lot of these challenges. And three of our goals and the questions that we asked that went along with those goals were, could we create a budget that would produce long-term sustainability for our school district? Not just FY19 sustainability, but over the next several years as we face some challenges in our district and in our state. And does the budget we create for this year enable us to sustain an adequate educational program now and in the future? Not just for FY19, but going forward too. And how can we be proactive in our response to fiscal and political realities? We don't work in a bubble, we don't work in a vacuum, or whatever the term is. We work in a larger community and in a larger fiscal realities and political realities, a lot of which is beyond our control. So how do we be proactive in response to that and avoid a culture of constant budget cutting? This was the thing that we wanted to do, was to really try to avoid every single year coming back with more and more budget cuts, because that can be really draining on personnel and draining on morale. We wanted to create a budget that enhanced educational equity for our students across grades and across schools. As you know, we're a newly uniformed school district. We have, for the first time, needed to create a budget that was a PK-12 budget, not just a PK-6 budget and a 7 through 12 budget, but one that treated our preschoolers the same as we treated our high schoolers in terms of educational opportunity and in terms of adequate resources to meet their educational needs. We also were suddenly budgeting for, I think, 9 school buildings, with different grades in each building, and wanting to make sure that we were respectful to what had been the traditions in each of those schools, while slowly moving the ball forward and modifying those traditions of budgeting to get everybody on the same page. So we wanted to, how could we allocate resources, including personnel, services, and programs across the district to ensure we were meeting student needs equitably? And how can we redistribute those resources smoothly and fairly for students, teachers, and parents? Not just a jolt to the system, but one that would take place over time so that people could get used to it and not suddenly upend everything that they were held dearly. And how could we be fiscally responsible to our community members? We wanted to build a budget and a resulting tax rate that was affordable and fair to our voters and taxpayers. Because we all know that our educational community is not just the people who show up at our meetings, it's not just the kids that come to our school, it's not just the parents who are the parents of those kids, it's not just the teachers who work in our school, but it's our broader community that has to foot the bill for whatever we decide our budget's going to be. So we really wanted to keep them in the loop as well and keep those people in the budget equation. So those are what we talked about all the time when we were meeting in committee. And I wish that Nick and Steve were here so that they could say, yes, that's true, we did. But Josh and Peter are here, and I think that they would agree that we did talk about those things all the time from the very beginning. So we did create a budget, and we created a budget, and then we created a new budget when things changed. And that's the fiscal reality and political realities that we're dealing with, is that on 1 week we had one fiscal reality, and literally 6 days later we had a different fiscal reality, and we had to adjust to that. And we created a budget based on that, and I know that that was a surprise and that was disturbing to a lot of people, but those are the fiscal realities in which we live, and the political realities in which we live, and in which we budget, and in which we have to react as a school district. It was not something that we said, hey, this is going to be fun. In 6 days, we're going to change things. It's just that that's the reality of the situation. So we created a budget that created a new Spanish language program for 4 of our schools that didn't have a Spanish language program. Bridport, Cornwall, Salisbury, and Shoreham. Those kids will now have the same opportunity to learn a foreign language that the kids in Mary Hogan, Weybridge, and Ripton already have. So we created educational equity with that. We created a new school psychologist position at Mary Hogan to support students' social and emotional needs, because we heard from teachers and we heard from parents that that was a need that needed to be addressed in that school. And I want to say, as the former chair of the ID4 school board, we have over the past few years, every single year, added student support system and positions to that school. This is not a new thing. This is something that's been happening incrementally over time as we've addressed needs at that school. These are not new needs, these are not new budget priorities, these are things that we have been doing every year all along. I looked back at the last 4 budget presentations I've done, and every single year we added support services to Mary Hogan School. We added an additional 2nd grade classroom teacher to Mary Hogan School. Just a couple of years ago, we reduced a classroom teacher there because we were adjusting to the enrollment realities of the school. This year, we looked at the enrollment realities and we added a classroom teacher. We targeted personnel reductions in schools and grades with the declining enrollments, specifically at MUHS and at MUMS, where those enrollments are declining enough, 50 students at the high school, 30 students at the middle school, enough so that we could successfully reduce our positions at that school without having a substantial effect on the educational resources at that school for our kids. And we created reserve funds to support teacher health care costs, unplanned educational needs, and facilities maintenance. We did that in response to a report that we commissioned that talked about the facility maintenance needs in our schools across our district. We did the teacher health care costs in response to a change in the state health care and the funding of state health care for teachers. And we created a reserve fund for educational expenses based on the fiscal responsibly reserve targets for public schools. And that will help us be more nimble in our responses to the fiscal and political realities that are beyond our control. Okay, this is the numbers page, and then we'll move on. The total budget is $36,762,479. That's a 1.32% decrease in the overall general fund budget. We increased the special reserve funds and the healthcare, the facilities, and the educational reserve fund to a percentage of about 4%. Is that what you're getting to, Josh? It's about 4% of our total budget. Our target that the Finance Committee talked about was 2 to 5%, which is very conservative for reserve funds. Talking to municipalities, they have reserve funds more in the 10% range. My brother, who's on a school board in Minnesota, has like a 20% reserve fund. So we tried to be very conservative in this, and in fact, some of us feel that we need to have bigger reserve funds. But we have a $1.5 million, a fairly substantial reserve fund. Our revenues decreased by almost 2%, and that was part of what we had to react to, was a decline in revenues across the board. So our net education spending, when you take the total budget, you add the reserve funds, and you subtract the revenue, you get the net budget. That actually increased by about 1.36%. So, but it's really a fairly modest increase with a declining enrollment of 50 pupils. The total equalized pupils strangely went up by 50 pupils, and people will remember that was the shift that happened in that 6-day period that I called the Hanukkah miracle, which was basically an adjustment by the state from a correction from previous years miscalculating our pupil numbers. It's not a real increase in our equalized pupil, but an adjustment to a past mess up or whatever. So we got an equalized spending per pupil of about $16,907 and a tax rate of about $1.64. Okay, this is Jason's slide. Does the budget meet our vision and our mission? Our vision is all students will reach their full academic potential and be prepared for success as engaged citizens. Our mission is to provide an innovative, rigorous, and supportive educational community that inspires a passion for learning and cultivates empathy and responsibility. So I try not to answer these questions in the slide. I gave some bullet points that I think lead to answers. But I would leave it to the board to decide whether the budget does these things. It does enhance continued implementation of IB curriculum. This was a question we asked our superintendent over and over again. We're still going to be able to do IB. We're still going to be able to do IB. Are we still going to be able to do IB? And the answer was yes, we're still going to be able to do IB. This is a commitment that this board made unanimously last year to move to an international baccalaureate curriculum that is innovative and rigorous. So I would say that yes, we do that. Broadens international and global education. It adds 4 elementary schools to our foreign language program. That for me was a personal goal, and one of the reasons I got on the school board in the first place was to expand that. So I love that we finally have it in all of our schools, or will finally. Deepen social, emotional, and cognitive support for our neediest students. This is the supportive educational community. By adding a school psychologist, which is what we heard from our leaders at Mary Hogan as a need that they had, on top of the already social emotional support systems that we have there. It better equalizes educational resources across schools and grades. The cuts that we've made, the reductions in personnel are targeted to the schools and the grades where we have declining enrollments. So they're not across-the-board cuts, because across-the-board cuts are inherently unequal. They enhance disequity. Targeted reductions in areas that have declining enrollment enhances equity. And targeted increases in areas where we have educational needs, student service needs, and increasing enrollments enhances equity. And the budget maintains strong support for extracurricular student activities, music and the arts, technical and career education, and early childhood education. There are no cuts to student activities or extracurricular. There are no cuts to music and the arts. The cuts to technical and career education are only because of declining enrollments at the Hannaford Center. We do not decrease any of our current programs at the high school. And early childhood education, we actually support more students in our pre-K program than we have in past years. Okay. Does the budget support excellent teachers? This was the Steve slide, so can everyone make sure he knows about this slide? Okay. We fully support our licensed teacher and support staff contracts that our committee, led by Chris Eaton, negotiated with our teachers and our support staff, and that includes all salary and benefits for our teachers. We create the $200,000 reserve fund to ensure that we fully fund teacher health care commitments. We provide an additional $40,000 of summer support opportunities for professional development. So teachers are able to enhance their professional development, get ready for IB, potentially have cultural competency training or whatever else our educational leaders believe is important for the professional development of our teachers. It endeavors to achieve reductions in positions through attrition and early retirements rather than layoffs. We tried really hard to work with our teachers union to make sure that we could achieve as many reductions through attrition and early retirements and not have to lay off teachers. I'm not sure how far we've gotten, but we have tried really hard. We've worked creatively with them. We've reached out to them. They've reached out to us. We've been talking all along with them to make sure that we do as well as we can and not lay off people. We target reductions, as I've said, I'm going to say it again, to grades in schools where enrollments are declining, and we target additions where enrollments are specifically increasing, like second grade at Mary Hogan. We move toward greater equity in class sizes and teaching loads, so that our teachers at Mary Hogan do not have significantly larger teaching loads and class sizes than our teachers and classes in our smaller elementary schools. We move toward greater equity. The class size average at Mary Hogan is decreasing. The class size at our small schools is increasing. So we're moving more toward equity in class size and teaching loads. We expand licensed staff to support students in need of psychological services and evaluation beyond recent increases in student support services. We specifically wanted to expand licensed, educated staff that can support our teachers, or support our students, and therefore our teachers with student needs. And we trust teachers as professionals and role models for their students. One of the things that we hear over and over again, that to be good parents, to be successful educators, is that we need to be resilient, that we need to be able to parent through change, and that we need to be able to be students through change. And that's what we're expecting of our teachers. We're expecting them to be role models and professionals and resilient through change. So we do, I believe, support excellent teaching, but you all can make your own conclusions. Did we budget to meet student needs? This was another question we got early on, that there was some feeling that the budget didn't actually, wasn't created to support student needs. This is a repeat of what I've said all along, but we support student needs through a rigorous and innovative IB implementation of curriculum. We enhance class size equity, we increase support services, we expand education, language education, we support excellent teachers, and we maintain all programs and activities. Is the budget fiscally responsible? I think this one is the one where we may have still some things to talk about beyond this board and beyond this room in our community, whether they decide to support the budget. But we have a modest decrease of 1.3% and a modest per pupil spending decrease of 1.79%. So we do have decreases that are contingent with our decreases in student enrollment. We're comfortably under the state spending threshold to avoid the double taxation. We increase the reserve rate to 4%, and reserved funds protect the district from state and federal funding declines, unexpected expenses, and undue financial risk. And it enables ongoing facility maintenance. By budgeting for reserve funds, we are being fiscally responsible. We target reductions based on student enrollment. Our tax rate increase is 2.7%, which is modest compared to the statewide average that was projected to be 9%. So it's less than 1/3 of what the statewide average increase to the tax rate was projected to be. So I think that we're trying to be as fiscally responsible as we can based on where we are with our student and our teaching needs. Does the budget meet long-term sustainability? You'll remember that this is one of the things that the Finance Committee was really wanting to do, was to create a budget that was not just for FY19, but that could lead us into FY20 and future years when we were going to have faced even greater fiscal challenges. The equalized pupil increase was ACSD's good fortune for FY19, that extra bump of 50 students that came in. And it will not continue for FY20. FY20, we will have a decline in our equalized pupil count, period, and significant projected enrollment declines over the next several years. That will put a significant crunch on our budgets, and it is not something that we can necessarily change. Rural populations across the country are declining. Rural populations in Vermont are the same as everywhere else. We are not going to see an increase of students unless we get lucky like we did this year. Many of our school buildings have maintenance needs that with hefty price tags beyond what we can budget for in our reserve funds. Is our budget sustainable with the current reserve fund and the current status of our building maintenance needs? The governor recently proposed, I think 2 days ago, Friday, he came out with a lovely memo, recently proposed additional cost containment and school funding reforms that would significantly impact ACSD's ability to raise revenue and meet current levels of expenditure and resource allocations across schools. Those are just proposals. The legislature has to still decide whether they like those proposals or have different ideas or like the status quo. But the fact is this is a major issue every single fiscal year at the state budget level. It is not going to go away, and there are always going to be new reforms. The problem with school finance, the problem with school policy is that it is constantly changing. We are a small state with some significant financial challenges. I started to list them here and I got a little depressed, so I deleted them. But I think everybody knows, we've all heard about the significant things that our state faces. And when a significant amount of our state resources goes toward K-12 education, it automatically puts a lot of pressure on us to come up with solutions so that we can free up resources to meet some of the other challenges our state faces. And federal funding and the federal government and our federal leader is unstable at best. So with all of these challenges, how can we avoid a culture of constant cuts and build annual budgets that are fair to our students and teachers and reasonably priced for our community members? That is a tough ask. That is a huge ask. And this board has worked incredibly hard to meet that goal. And I want our community members to know that. Work to be done sooner rather than later. I know that we talked about 5 to 10 year plan. This slide is actually for me, and I would say that I would like to see a 2 to 3 year plan. We don't have 5 to 10 years. We need to do this work in 2 to 3 years. And the first thing we need to do is fully engage community members in planning and budgeting. Not just those who show up at meetings and in our inboxes, but full community engagement. There are a lot of methods for engaging communities in budgeting. Community-based budgeting is an actual thing, and I've talked about it with our Finance Committee, and I hope that this board embraces it for our next budget. We need to extend equity budgeting to administrative and school leadership allocations, including principals and central office budgets. The central office budget reduction in FY19 was public, and that was a $50,000 reduction in FY19 based on our merger budget. But federal funding reductions prevented this reality, but I, for one, expect that to become a reality sooner rather than later. And the superintendent is committed to reducing principals by at least 1.6 FTEs in FY20. You know, we have some principals in the audience. This was in our first budget proposal. It was taken out, and there was a public commitment by our superintendent to make sure that this happened next year. This is sooner rather than later. In order to do that, though, we have to figure out some other questions. We can't just take principals out of schools. What are we going to do? I think we need to revisit the decision on the best placement for 6th graders, if possible, for FY20. This was a decision that we delayed last year. It needs to happen sooner rather than later. We have to reinvent the ACSD map. and examine which of our 10 school buildings, and I'm including the Hannaford School Building because we own that building, and examine which of our 10 school buildings, I guess they didn't finish that, should continue to be in use. Include examination of enrollments, facility health and configuration, and population patterns. Patterns. And examine all of these options through a lens of educational excellence, equity, and fiscal responsibility. And we have to build consensus, or at least compromise, about what is best for all students, schools, and communities underneath the ACSD umbrella. So what are your questions? I'm happy to take questions. I'm sure Peter and Josh are if you actually want numbers. So.
So this is our third or fourth sort of public meeting about the budget. We've had lots of Q&A back and forth, but tonight's night we'll be adopting the budget. So this is the time for you folks. If you have questions, why don't we start off with questions, and then if there are comments after that, we can take comments. Yes, please. Could you tell us who you are and what town you're from?
Oh, sure. I'm Amy Mason. I'm from Waybridge, and the last slide just struck me, Ruth, because of your priorities there, and I was curious about the ordering of it. I noticed looking at the 6th grade configuration, and then the one about the 10 buildings.
Mm-hmm.
Just could you speak to about why, like, is there an ordering thought about those, or would they happen at the same time?
Well, first of all, it's not up to me to decide the order of it individually. I have my own opinions. I will tell you that I was creating this slide presentation under less than ideal circumstances, and so I was trying to put that slide together quickly at the end and trying to include a lot of things that I think the board needs to address and the community as a whole needs to address. I think that the question about our school configuration and our 6th grade, so our grade configuration and our building configuration, kind of has to be in tandem, because what happens with 6th grade could affect what happens with all of our other schools, our elementary schools, excuse me. And it could affect the high school too. I mean, there's certainly, like, you could do 6 through 9. There are lots of configurations you could think about. And so I think right now we have capacity at MUMS. That is clear. And MUMS is in such an excellent school and has such excellent leadership. And yes, I'm sucking up to Chris, who's sitting close to me. But it's such a great school. We want to take advantage of that. And so I think that 6th grade question really needs to be addressed again. And we have a whole report on that. And so that would, I think, lead into the question of the 10 school buildings. And there are a lot of answers to that.
Before we get into a long discussion about it, as Ruth, I think, was pretty clear about, that last slide was really Ruth's thoughts on this, and wasn't really reflective of the board, because we haven't had that conversation in total yet.
Gotcha, yeah, just because felt like that part of it wasn't part of the last discussion so much.
That's right.
So I was curious.
It's been part of the discussion in that a lot of community members have brought it up, saying we need to have this discussion sooner rather than later. And I think it's especially important for Middlebury community members to feel like that their schools are not always on the chopping block. So I think that and Jen leads a committee that started to talk about this and hasn't yet reported to the board, but I think that that's coming soon, so that we'll have more information about what direction her committee's heading.
Yeah, so currently there is a a master planning committee and project that's going on, that's meeting with an outside consultant soon, and is beginning to frame the questions that we want to go to the community with to discuss as we talk about the future of the district and sort of how we envision it. And that includes everything from grade configuration to school building facilities to, much more sort of abstract concepts.
Who's the consultant you're working with? I didn't realize you were working with a consultant.
Bob Mason.
Who's that?
He was the CFO at Chittenden South and just retired, I think, 6 months ago.
And so when do you expect you'll bring this information to the full board?
Well, that meeting just got scheduled, and I was checking my email in the 20 minutes that I was getting ready to come here. I think before the next board meeting, we're meeting with him, is that correct? The 5th or something?
February
Meeting on the
5th.
5th, yeah.
So I think it's the hour before the next meeting, and then I feel like our committee would then need, I'm hoping that next meeting, that second meeting of the month, is when we're supposed to have that first hour for committee. I'd like to spend some time with our committee for that hour, and if we feel at that point we can come up with something cohesive to talk to the board about, I feel like that would be a good goal for us.
So in March, maybe.
No, that second
Oh, the
second
second
February
February
meeting.
meeting. Okay.
Because we would be meeting with him the first. We've had our own preliminary meetings and done some research on our own and done some reading from a planning handbook. And so I feel like we have some background, but before we go any further, we'd like to meet with a consultant just to kind of see, okay, these are our goals and which should the timeline be? When should we include community and discussions and things like that? And that's what we would then present to the board as our plan moving forward after we've met with a consultant.
Anybody else, comments, question? Yes, if you wouldn't mind telling us who you are?
Middlebury.
I'm sorry?
Jennifer McCarty.
Hi.
Middlebury. I've heard the term equity used a lot tonight, previous meeting. I'm wondering if there's a concrete definition of what this means, because when I talk to my neighbors and friends, I don't think it's exactly what we think it means.
Yeah, I think this is something we struggled with just as a board, but also as a finance committee to define equity. And I think it's one of those terms that is often, we all have our different definitions. Like you said, your neighbor could have a different definition than you do.
Right.
And
Wondering
so.
what the board's definition is.
So we don't have a complete definition. One of the things that we looked at as a finance committee was equity in terms of class sizes and student-to-teacher ratios and student-to-staffing ratios, and then and also resource allocation. Do all of our schools have the same programs? So that's when we got to that. Oh, actually, 4 of our schools don't have a language program, so we need to fix that because that makes it more equitable. So I don't think this budget or any budget would achieve perfect equity, but I think this moves us closer to sort of hopefully at least closer to equity, closer to a reasonable definition of educational equity.
Right.
Could I just add
Yes, oh,
something
please.
just to the equity piece? I think as a leadership team, we talked about equity over the summer and created a definition for an equity lens that we would use in our work. And the equity lens is about really providing resources where there's greatest need. And that's where I think in terms of a definition and looking at the application of that lens and that definition, that's where it becomes challenging because there is some subjectivity in looking at so how do you define greatest need? Is it based on a certain measurement of poverty? Is it measured on achievement? Is it measured on metrics in terms of kind of home need? So there are lots
I was
of
kind of getting to a metric or metrics that you're using to establish this term equality or equity that you're bringing up.
So there is, but there's not. The issue is that the system is very complex. So there's not one metric that we could use to say this is exactly what we need in every school building. We also have regular general classroom teachers, and then we have support services as well. So that, primarily how school districts fund and function in terms of need is not through a general classroom teacher. That is kind of those numbers in terms of ratios of teacher to classroom is really kind of separate from the support services we provide, which include and can include some of our paraprofessionals, can include psychologists, can include behavioral interventionists, et cetera. So we've got a whole other system that kind of undergirds the general system. We're working to try to bring those two things together. So that's something that we're working to not have those two realities be in isolation, but be one. And that's really part of our work in terms of developing in a new district with International Baccalaureate. to have a one cohesive system. But the question about, for example, the initial budget reduction of paraprofessionals brought a lot of questions about support and need, and that's work that we're doing prior to our next budget, so that we are all aligned around what does the research tell us, what do we know is going to work best for students, and we can talk about that as we look at our budget to say this is the research that we've done in building this new model, and this is how the money is going to support that.
Thank you for your question. All right, so board members, any further, I realize we've been through this now several times, but any further questions about the budget, any further comment? And what we'll do, actually, I'll tell you what, why don't we do this? We'll have a motion to adopt the budget as presented in the budget book, a second, and then we'll move into discussion.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Ruth, move-
To adopt the budget as presented in the budget book.
Yes, Jim.
Was there anything that has come up since our last meeting a week ago that changes in the budget book? I know when we left it, it didn't sound like there was going to be, although there were some questions. So
There's the one
There are a
change
few updates.
is,
that's what I mean.
are there more than, go ahead. You-
Well,
There was
Josh
an early
made some
retirement or
updates.
like 1.5
Yeah.
early retirements, and that's why it decreased a little bit more.
Okay.
But that's basically it.
And then was there additional staffing movement at central office?
So we reworked the page on central office because we had, to denote the loss of grant funding for current positions, we moved that out of an FTE frame to just the dollar amount of the cost that we had to cover. And then we did also include the .2 CO curriculum leader reduction that we made as well.
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah.
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 And I want to note, and Peter and Conlon and I have talked about this, this budget does include, as did our budget, our current year budget, includes stipends for school board members of $500. Those were in annually. So that's in our current budget. There's no change to that. But there was some question as to whether we needed to specifically note that when we were passing the budget.
Well,
Did you
so
get further information on that?
Yeah, so I think what we need to do, and it wasn't on the agenda for tonight, so we'll put it on for the next meeting, is we actually need to vote on that, not that, it doesn't need to be set in the annual meeting. But
It
just
can't
needs
be
to
done as part of the budget. It has to be a separate vote.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, just to set the rate.
Okay.
Yeah.
But just so you know, that's what's in there.
Yeah.
So don't calculate that on an hourly basis. Okay. So-
All right, yeah, further questions, further discussion on this?
I'm just
Yes, Jen.
curious more than anything else, the million or so in reserves, how is that saved, invested, kept safe, making any money?
It is making money. It doesn't make a lot of money because most of it is just kept in accounts at our bank. So it's just in savings accounts. So they're not making huge sums of money.
Probably under 1%, right?
Yeah. We could certainly look into that. We really haven't had anything yet in ACSD to make any money on. So.
Right.
Yeah.
But maybe you could think about if there's enough now, put it someplace making a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely.
Are you statutorily sort of
Right.
hemmed in by where you can actually invest the money?
I'd have to look into that. I don't know all the requirements.
Yeah, I think
Makes
that
sense, though.
there are laws about,
I was thinking junk bonds. I don't know.
Bitcoin.
Yeah, Bitcoin. Let's go Bitcoin.
I'm thinking more like CDs,
Yeah.
something safe that could just make a couple more percent.
we do have an investment policy that's part of our finance policies
Okay.
that invests our small little endowment that we have.
Yep.
So that would certainly cover this to the extent that we have it, but I'm not sure that cash flow would make it so that we ever have too much in there, but I don't know.
Yeah, we'd have to think
Yeah.
about the
Yeah.
different
Yeah,
pieces
exactly.
and parts.
Yeah.
I was just curious.
One of the things that we have to be thinking about is just in looking at this legislative session and what's happening, and you don't know who the next governor is going to be, and you don't know what's going to happen. So if some of the recommendations came true that Governor Scott put forward on Friday, it would, one of them brings the cost per pupil down right exactly where this proposed budget is. So that would have us right at the threshold. There's lots of other pieces there in terms of allowable growth. Something like that could come out of nowhere in 2022, in, who knows when. So having that reserve, I just think is that much more important, given, I think, how unstable it looks at the state level. So that's part of, in thinking about where we're going to invest it, we would want it in a place where we could pull it out to use it when needed.
Absolutely.
I will just note that of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 board members missing tonight, I have heard, Peter, I have heard from 4 who are all supportive of the budget as presented.
Did you hear from Perry?
Yes. I spoke
Okay,
with him
he's
after
the
our last
fourth.
meeting.
Okay, yeah.
So I would just like to say that, I think our budget does reflect the goals as we heard in the presentation. And I think, frankly, given the fiscal realities of the state, that we are looking at a 4.3% tax rate increase when the state is predicting over 9% for most places, that we are not only being responsible to our taxpayers, but we're actually being quite responsible to the education funding system overall, and I think we should be happy with that.
There's just so many things that are out of our control. I know that's not an excuse, but that is the realities that you point out.
Also-
And even to the differences in the town's tax rates in our district that are related to
Common level of appraisal.
common level of appraisal and those kinds of other things. It just makes the job of selling it to the individual person and where they live really difficult, I think, because it's not conceptually, you have a dollar amount and you collect taxes and that's how you fund your schools. It's nowhere close to that. So we can only go on what we can go on.
All right, are we prepared for the vote? Yeah, oh,
Jason.
Jason, excuse me.
So to follow up on my question from last week, and I do appreciate the slide.
I was thinking of you, Jason.
I know. This is a question probably as much for Peter and central office administrators and principals as it is for the board, but certainly it's for the board. How do we move from a business as it was done before, reactionary model of budgeting, to a model of building our budget that is forward-looking, that aligns with our strategic plan? I mean, what's the point of doing the strategic planning process if we're not using that as a foundation for all of the work that we're doing as a board? The budget conversation should be starting every year and several years out with how are we going to fund the plan that we have, right? And no, I'm not blind to the fiscal realities of where we're at, and it's going to change again. But what we can do is, and what we have done with the strategic plan, is set the landscape. And we have a path and we have a direction, right? But we're not approaching we're having to go back and backfill answers to that question, right? Like that slide comes at the end of this process. For purposes of the board conversation and the public conversation, I'm not saying that you aren't having those thoughts or doing that thinking ahead of time, but in terms of the conversation around the budget, we jump to that, like, oh, we got to fill this in. With fidelity, I think, and with care, but we have to, as a board, figure out how we're going to change how we practice this work. We have not done that. We have not yet fulfilled the sort of promise of innovation that we made around unification as a board. Sure, it's early, but we're year 2, and we're still essentially operating as a conglomeration of a bunch of legacy board members. And we're not going to be able to be resilient in this environment unless this board leads in changing our practice. And that's going to take leadership from the chair. It's going to take engagement from all of us as board members. And it's really going to take engagement by community members as well. But we're seeing that, right? In this process, we heard extensively from folks who stepped up to try and make sure that there was some accountability to what we discussed in the unification process. And I hope that that continues as a level of engagement, but I really am struggling with how to respond and really decide on what is fundamentally the same model that we've always been doing, right? And we're not going to see a shift toward more resilience and more stability unless we change that effort. So I don't necessarily have an answer to how we do that, but I'd like to see us really engage in that conversation a little more directly, both tonight and on an ongoing basis, in how we get there.
All right. We have a motion and a second. I'm sorry, I was taking your question as rhetorical, and I didn't know if would anybody like to respond? As you said, Ruth?
Sure. I mean, I agree, that's what strategic plans are for, is that you have a strategic plan and then you base everything off them. I think there was some questions from the board when that strategic plan was created as to whether it was the board's strategic plan or the administrator's strategic plan. So not that that's an excuse, but I do think that there was, it wasn't a strategic plan that was created by the school board. It was a strategic plan that was created by the administration. So I think that that has made it a little clunky for the board to react to it. I think that when the finance committee started meeting, we tried to set, and that's what I started with, that first slide of, sustainability, equity, and responsibility as the sort of budgeting parameters that we were working off from. And we had a lot of conversations about the level of community engagement that was appropriate. And we had disagreement, and I was in the minority on what level of community engagement was appropriate and how we could be involving the full board and the full community in the budget. So we were somewhat constrained by the decisions that the committee made to have it more narrow conversation. I do think there's an opportunity as we move forward to use the committee work that Jen's committee is doing and combine it with the strategic plan and really move forward. I'm eager to hear what that committee is doing and who the consultant is and what the plans are, and bring it as a broader board conversation, because it can't be a committee conversation. It needs to be a broader community and board conversation. And hopefully through that work, we can start to do it. I think one of the things, with the sort of term sustainability, it was an attempt to try to build a budget that was proactive and looked forward and saying, okay, we know coming down the pike we're going to lose this many students, and we know coming down the pike we're going to be implementing IB, and we know that we have these facility needs, and we know that we have this configuration of schools, and we know that we have these questions looming about student needs. And so we were trying to budget long term. Of course, we only created 1 year budget. And I think that unfortunately that's all we can do, given how much, as Chip said, is beyond our control. But we did try to think long term in the budgeting, and that actually the first budget proposal we put forward, as painful as that was for everybody involved, including the community members who showed up en masse, that was a budget that we were trying to say we're going to take care of a lot of needs in 1 year, like a lot, because unfortunately that whole conversation about whether or not we're creating a culture of cuts, I'm not sure we're avoiding that. We're going to probably have to continue to have budget reductions every year given the fiscal reality. So can we do that thoughtfully? Can we do it in a way that continues to be open and continues to meet student needs? I hope so. But the only way we're going to be able to do that is to do what you're suggesting, which is to tie it to either our strategic plan or the plan that Jen's committee is building or some other larger conversation that involves a broader group of people beyond a three-person committee. So I hear you. Whether it's tied to the strategic plan, that's something I'm not as tied to, because I think that we need to have a broader thing than that. That's more based on what the board is talking about in the community. And frankly, the strategic plan is now like 3 years old, isn't it?
It's in year 3 right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So by next year, it'll be in its 4th year, so we'll be, and it's a 5-year plan. So we're gonna be in the place where we're redoing that plan, and maybe this is an opportunity to take the work that we're all doing and create a new strategic plan that's actually created by the board and the educational leadership, and not just the educational leadership.
Chris?
Yeah, I think that, I can't speak for everyone here, but I speak for me personally, and I think we're all feeling the exact same thing right now, and I think that we've had 2 years, 1 year to figure out how to even function as a brand new board, because we didn't exist, and I think that the second year has been dealing with a lot of heavy lifting, whether it was a negotiation that's never had to happen before, or create a new entity that's never existed before. And it's been heavy lifting for us, for the administration, for the teachers, and some change everywhere. And I think that we're finally reaching, because of the work that's gone in these last 2 years, and it hasn't been easy, I don't think, for most of us, to be at a place, because we have a budget that I think is putting us in a good place, to now begin to really have those conversations. And that's what I've felt frustration because we haven't had those conversations yet. I think most of us at this table probably have, obviously Jason has. So I'm happy with where we are, and now we get to start really doing the work of a board, which is the longer term vision, and talking about where we want to be, and not just who we are, but it's taken us 2 years. So,
Now the fun starts, right?
yeah.
Yes.
There has to be.
We are, I just wanted sort of to bring things, we are talking about the motion on the table, which is to adopt the
Yeah, I know, but it's
budget.
still, the reactionary component, and the word reactionary that you use at times is a negative, in a negative context, but in actual fact, again, we have to be reactionary because there are many things which are constantly changing. And I think if we're not reactionary to some degree, then I don't know how, it would be perfect if we could just say, this is what it's gonna all be in 5 years, and this we're gonna predict and how it's gonna happen. But the reactionary part, I think, is part of our job too, is reacting to what it's gonna be, whether it's financial, decreased enrollment, or new teaching styles, IB. So all of those, we have to react. So I don't wanna use the word reactionary as a negative connotation, which means that we're only limited to that type of response to something, because I think it really goes together all the way along, so.
Means we're being nimble, right?
Yeah, adapting.
Yeah, adapting, well, I mean, there's a lot of ways to put it, but the reactionary always seems to have this sort of a negative term, at least in this kind of context, and I don't think that's really true. It's how you react. If you don't react,
Then you have
stupid
trouble.
too, then you had trouble.
All right, we ready for a vote on the motion before us? Let's do a show of hands. All those in favor, say, or raise your hand, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We have a unanimous, anybody opposed?
Do you want to vote
Abstain?
for it too, so you
Yes,
can be on the
I'm in that,
record?
it was unanimous vote in favor of it.
Thank you, I got my unanimous vote! You guys rock!
Make a comment too,
yes.
relative to the lack of participation by other board members. It was a major scheduling problem because this is out of our normal, a normal style. So all of them, obviously, that you polled or talked to would want it to be here. But it just was not going to work for them. So it wasn't diligent, or it wasn't,
We have scheduling problems, we have injuries, and we have bad roads.
right, yeah. But I mean, I think that's the component of, for the television audience and all, that it's
That's right.
not disinterest.
So we have, budget-wise, we have 2 more pieces of business to do. We need to adopt our warnings. The first
So moved.
is for the annual meeting, and again, this is just to elect the officers, to hear the reports, to to borrow money, and then the public information session.
And the special, just a point of clarification, the articles to create those,
That's on, that, we're gonna.
that's on the
Second-
special meeting, that's on the, okay.
Second motion. First motion is to adopt the public, or the warning for the school district for the annual meeting on February 27th. And I heard a so move from Ruth, yes?
Yep.
And a second,
I'll second it.
Chip? All those in favor of adopting the warning as printed, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We have the warning. Now, the second one is the Australian ballot warning. And this essentially says, shall the voters of the Addison Central School District vote to authorize the ACSD School Board to expend the $36,762,479, which is the amount that the ACSD School Board has determined to be necessary for the ensuing fiscal year, with the equalized per pupil spending of 16,907.29. Article 2 of that, shall the voters vote to authorize the school board to appropriate $823,673 of the FY 2017 unassigned fund balance to the ACSD Capital Reserve Fund, and then again, another $500,000 to the Education Reserve Fund. I'm sorry, the first one was for the Capital Reserve Fund, second for the Education Reserve Fund, and the third to the Healthcare Reserve Fund under Article 4. Who would like to move that?
So moved.
Thank you.
Seconded.
I have one question.
Yes.
I'm assuming you checked into this, Josh, but in the past, Bridport has had 10 to 7, I think, is their hours for voting, not 7 to 7?
We did check into that.
You did?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
They are at 7 to 7? Okay.
Salisbury's just sleeping in. Don't worry about them.
Ooh, 8 o'clock.
Our beauty sleep in Salisbury.
So are these 4 separate votes or checks, or is it just one?
Four X's.
Okay.
They are.
So
Yeah,
in
they're
fact-
separate articles.
Yeah.
They could be broken up and some get okayed
Sure.
and some don't.
Right.
That's correct.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. All those in favor of adopting the warning for the Addison Central School District special meeting on March 6th, please say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Thank you. We have adopted both warnings. All right. We now have a annual action item. This is to set the school choice capacity at MUHS. We did this last year, and traditionally the UD3 board has done it in previous years. You want to talk about the number and how we got up with it, came up with it? This, by the
So
way,
this-
is for school choice, public school choice. Our surrounding high schools have the option for a certain number of students to be able to apply to attend neighboring public high schools at no charge.
Yeah, so secondary school choice is in statute. It's grades 9 through 12. And every year, school districts set the number of slots they're going to let in. They can also set limits on the number of students that leave. We've never had an issue with students leaving, a significant number leaving, so we haven't set the number out. We do set the number in. The money does not follow the students to the school as part of the legislation. There has been work in past legislative sessions to try to change that, but it hasn't happened. So traditionally, we've set 15. Bill and I have talked about this and feel that 15 is still a good number. That would allow 4 students in the coming year. So we'd have 11 continuing at the high school from
it's a
other
total of-
communities.
For the whole 4 years.
9 through 12, a total number of students, yes.
Do they count in our equalized pupil, or they're not?
No.
Not at all?
We don't, the other schools count them and receive money for them. I mean, they're part of their equalized pupil number.
And how
But not
many
part of
do
ours.
we have leave?
2 or 3.
2 or 3, yeah.
So why do we do it? Just curious.
Because we have to.
We're required to, the law is kind of soft in terms of giving you guidance in terms of how many slots to open. just to see what the averages were across Chittenden and Addison, I sent a query to all the superintendents last week and asked them, how many do you let in and out? And the 15 is for our size, looks about right. Our neighbors in Addison County are 10. They accept 10 in, and they also limit the number out. They have more students leaving than we do.
Do they they set the number at 10, do they fill the slots, presumably?
No,
But we do.
we do.
You usually have a waiting list for them, correct?
Yeah, yep,
But once you're in, you're in.
yep.
Yes.
Okay, I mean, that's what I assume.
We have to run a lottery because we have so many. We have to run a lottery to let
Josh,
them in. Other schools have to have a lottery.
To get out.
Select the 10 to get out.
oh, wow. So sad.
So
Can I ask a question of Josh?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, you
Chris.
go.
Have you looked at this in terms of the fiscal impact on us, besides the, the average equalized people cost? Is there any kind of marginal, because it's obviously a marginal impact, not a general impact.
No, we haven't looked at it.
I would just hate to turn kids away. I'm wondering how many we're turning away. And these are kids who are wanting to have our great educational opportunities. How many are we turning away on average?
Depends on the year.
Depends, a few, 3.
Okay.
I mean, it is a cost. I mean, it's additional time for teachers. It may not have a direct impact on staffing, for example, but in terms of.
What's the argument for the money not following the student?
The argument from towns that are losing a lot of students, it makes it hard for them to continue to survive. If they have a lot of students leaving.
Schools that are declining get more students leaving and it perpetuates.
Yes, Bill.
Yeah, just relative to that, tomorrow evening I'm going over to Rochester because Rochester has closed their high school because their enrollment was declining to the point. And so now they're holding a fair tomorrow night for the residents of Rochester to view other surrounding schools. And if those students come to whatever school they go to, their town pays the tuition rate. So hopefully we'll, attract some students who would be able to be
But that's not school choice, that's tuition.
That would be tuition, yeah.
And in the bigger political realm about the money following the student or not, some feel that if you were to, have a change in statute that would have the money following the student, that it opens up a can of worms into a discussion about basically full-time, free choice vouchers and all of that, and people have avoided it from a political point of view.
Football teams and
Jason?
all kids.
Um,
No, it is in the schools.
You said, Bill, you indicated that it was the number of kids we were turning away was somewhere on the order of 2 or 3-ish. Obviously, we don't know.
So it's different every year. I think last year we had, I think 3 more applications than we could admit, so we had to run a lottery.
Do you get the sense that it ranges greater than 5 or 10 at any point in time that we can't admit?
I doubt it. I don't think so. I'm trying to remember back a couple of years. It might have gone as high as 5, but it's not like twice the number that were accepted or anything like that.
So I guess I'm curious as to, if we're talking about a relatively small number of students that we're turning away, what our thinking is for limiting it to 15 rather than a number that would sort of historically allow those students who really do want to come here to do so.
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so.
It's a kind of administrative recommendation.
It's always been that way, first of all, so I don't know how far back. I'm not saying that makes it right. No, I'm just saying.
Ever.
I'm not sure, what I'm saying is I'm not sure how it was established initially in terms of that number. I think it's you have to look at what's the balance of supporting the students within your own district, because you're taking students from a place there's no money coming into the school system, And so you really kind of have to balance, we're talking earlier about equity and support. So the more students that you have in the high school, it's, depending on, every individual, we can't quantify how much extra time that takes for the system, but it does divert from the people that are funding the system and that we're responsible for. So I think to me, that's part of the question about what's the right number.
So,
I mean, to me, it would be ideal if we could open it up, and then, as we do with tuition students, we receive the funding to support those students and other students. That
all
makes
of
sense.
that combined with Josh's answer that he hasn't quantified the cost on this, and which makes sense. Why would you spend your time? We're talking about 15 students to do that, but that really begs the question of why make what is essentially an arbitrary distinction because it's sort of historically accurate, when the margin between that number and the number of sort of historically of kids who would want to come is pretty narrow.
You could end up with twice as many. I mean, there's a cost to that, and we're in a year where we're cutting budgets, and we're trying to look out for the students within our district already.
I'm not hearing that we could have twice as many. I asked the question. That's why I asked the question
Well,
about
if it's
2 or 3
to 5 a
typically.
year,
Right. So
over the course of 4 years,
if the
that's
difference is between
12.
having 15 slots and 20 slots, I mean,
well, if you're going to take everyone who applies, then you're getting.
I think that's a really great way to redirect the question. I mean, that's not the answer that we just got.
Oh,
Well,
sorry,
I guess
heard
I
3 to
could
5 a
offer a
year,
little bit
so
of
that's-
just input. If you were to open up to everybody, then the 40 some odd students that we get from Hancock, Granville, and Rochester would then also be coming to our school for free. And that would be a huge difference, because that's almost $500,000 in revenue that we would lose.
So I feel like this.
No, but those are tuition students. That's a different program.
This is a really kind of interesting way to.
But
to
not if we
really
open up to school choice.
redirect what I'm
We open up
asking.
to everybody.
School choice.
I didn't say that though. I'm curious as to why this keeps coming back to that, because that's not at all what I just said. I asked a very specific question, which is historically over time, how many kids do we turn away from this particular program, right? And the answer was 2 to 3, 3 to 4, no more than 5 per year, but students graduate every year. So we've set historically a distinction at 15. We don't know what the costs are, but the answer is it's a cost, but it's marginal. We don't know what it is. What is the rationale that underpins not setting that number at a number that can address the historical interest and need for those kids who want to come here? I mean, it seems sort of arbitrary to say to those 2 or 3 kids who might want to really come here and might really take advantage of what we have, and maybe even have something really to offer our student body in terms of their participation, just because that's the way it's always been done. And to say, well, if we just open it up to everybody, that doesn't answer the question. That's not what I'm talking about, and that's not what I'm asking. And it doesn't really get to this issue.
Chris, I would agree that it's kind of arbitrary, but you could look at it from the other way and say, why don't we set it at 11 and not take any kids this year? And if you do let 3 kids in or 4 kids in every year for the 4 years, then we would basically double the size we would have. Because next year, 4 kids would leave, roughly on average, and we'd have 3 to 4 more kids than we can take because we'd have 4 new slots. So once you play that out after 4 years, if we argue this argument every year, we will basically have doubled the amount.
We could just set it at 20.
Right,
and
but
then-
next year,
But just set it at 20, and then 20 just becomes the new limit.
arbitrarily, because next year
Yeah,
when we're
it's-
having this conversation.
Granted, it's all arbitrary.
Next year when we're having this conversation and 4 kids leave, because on average there's 11, so it's either 4 or 3 out of the other 3 classes. There's going to be 3 or 4 new slots, and in theory there will be 3 or 4 kids that would get left out on average.
Yeah.
So we would let in, if this argument holds, we would want to let those kids in.
I don't understand how that
Right, are you seeing it as 15 per year or 15 total? I guess that's where the
15
confusion
total
is.
at any point in
Okay.
time that are here by choice, right?
Yes.
Right, so the number of kids that stay or go
Yes.
on an average year is what? Like, how many of these kids are graduating a year?
So we're three or four that are estimated to graduate this year.
Okay.
Which I would imagine is on average, right? Roughly, yes. Yeah.
The spread, I don't have the exact grade level spread in my mind, but I looked at it a week ago, and it's about the same. There are
3 or 4 every year.
4 kids in each grade.
Right.
So
And every year.
On average, every year, we have somewhere in the order of 3 to 4 slots that we're opening up, right? Is that right?
Yes. And every year, on average, we reject 3 or 4, in addition to those slots that open up.
6 or 8 who want to come.
So as we play out the next 4 years, if we have this conversation every year, we will be doubling, roughly, the number of kids each year.
Right. That's to say, if you weren't to cap it at 20. But anyway, we're going to move on to
Is
this
there a
conversation. But
motion?
what I would say, it has not been a motion.
Okay.
But, I think one thing to bear in mind is that many of these kids who come here for our sports program. And, I feel a certain obligation as to who our sports programs are for. And, if we start increasing the numbers for sports programs that are already oversubscribed, we could have students from other districts muscling out students, especially in the varsity sports, from our own district as a result.
Literally muscling.
And we have no one to play.
And I really, it has been, 15's been historic. It is, I think one could say arbitrary. I'm not sure any school has been able to come up with anything besides an arbitrary number. The state really doesn't come in and evaluate your capacity and what you can handle and what you can't handle. I think that'd be very hard to quantify. We have a proposal before us for this year. Yes,
I
Chris?
just wanted to, maybe, Bill, you've said this, but could I just ask you, is this a comfortable number for you and what you see on both sports and in school? Okay. So it's entirely arbitrary.
Yeah, it has been 15 for the years that I've been setting this number. And I think if there's going to be a change, then we're going to probably need some better analysis. But for right now, we have to set the number by statute.
We can calculate a marginal cost. There's actually a formula for calculating marginal cost.
Is it the state budget?
No, it would be a separate thing that Josh and I could work on together in our free time.
Is there a motion?
There isn't a motion. So I would like to have a motion that we
I'll move that we
set it at 15.
vote to set it at 15.
Second.
Yes.
In a second. Any further discussion?
I don't like turning people away, but I guess I'm okay with 15.
All right, all those in favor of setting the public school choice number at 15, please say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed, nay? We have set the number. Any abstentions?
Abstain.
One abstention. All right, anything else before we head into executive session? If not, I would entertain a motion to enter executive session to discuss a property contract as well as a negotiation issue. We have a
Thanks for coming,
move
you guys.
from Lorraine. How
I'll
about a
second
second?
it.
Second from Jen. All those in favor of going into executive session?
Aye.
Please say aye.
Aye.
And we will take a 5-minute break and move into executive session.